On the morning of January 28, 1986, the world witnessed one of the darkest moments in space history. The Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Cape Canaveral, carrying 7 crew members, including teacher Krista McAuliffe, who was set to become the first civilian in space. Just 73 seconds after liftoff, the shuttle disintegrated before the eyes of millions watching on live television. The tragedy shocked a nation and devastated the families of those on board. But what makes this event even more unsettling is the number of strange decisions, overlooked warnings, and troubling facts that surrounded the mission. More than 3 decades later, these details continue to raise questions about how such a preventable disaster could have happened. Today, we will examine 17 strange things that never made sense about the Challenger disaster. The freezing cold morning that should have delayed the launch, the morning of January 28, was unusually frigid for Florida. Temperatures dipped below freezing, and ice was seen hanging from the launch pad, something rarely observed at Cape Canaveral. Shuttle launches had strict weather guidelines, and ice was considered a serious risk because it could damage the shuttle's heat-resistant tiles or interfere with mechanical components. The cold also posed a direct threat to the O-rings inside the solid rocket boosters, which were designed to seal the joints and prevent hot gases from escaping. These O-rings had never been tested in temperatures anywhere near as low as those that morning. Engineers on site voiced concerns about the safety of launching under such conditions, yet the countdown moved forward. What is particularly strange is that NASA had previously delayed launches for less critical weather issues, yet in this case, with visible ice and freezing temperatures, the agency chose to proceed. Later investigations confirmed that the O-rings became brittle in the cold, failing to seal properly. The decision to ignore the extreme weather remains one of the most haunting aspects of the tragedy. It was a clear warning sign that safety was compromised, yet the urgency to launch outweighed common sense. The ignored warnings from Morton Thiokol engineers. Perhaps the most disturbing fact about Challenger is that the disaster was predicted before it happened. The night before the launch, Morton Thiokol engineers, who were responsible for building the solid rocket boosters, strongly advised against liftoff. Roger Boisjoli and several of his colleagues argued that the O-rings would not perform reliably in the freezing weather. They presented data, memos, and years of observations showing that O-ring erosion increased at lower temperatures. In their view, launching on January 28 was an unacceptable risk. Initially, Thiokol management agreed with the engineers, recommending that NASA delay the launch. However, NASA officials pushed back, emphasizing the importance of sticking to the schedule. Under immense pressure, Morton Thiokol executives reversed their stance, silencing their own engineers. What makes this so strange is that NASA prided itself on being a data-driven organization, yet when faced with hard evidence of danger, it chose to prioritize schedule and politics over science. Boisjoli later testified before Congress, visibly emotional, stating that he had known the launch was a grave mistake. His warnings went unheeded, and the result was catastrophic. This disregard for expert voices remains one of the most baffling elements of the disaster. The pressure to launch for public relations. Unlike other shuttle missions, Challenger carried a unique passenger, Krista McAuliffe, a high school teacher from New Hampshire selected for the Teacher in Space program. Her inclusion was meant to inspire students across America, and her lessons from orbit were scheduled to be broadcast nationwide. This made Challenger more than a space mission, it was a media event. Schools across the country planned to watch the launch live, and President Ronald Reagan was preparing to mention McAuliffe in his State of the Union address that very night. The mission had already been delayed several times due to weather and minor technical issues, frustrating NASA officials who were eager to deliver a success. The pressure to finally get Challenger into the sky was enormous. It is strange that NASA, an agency built on scientific rigor, allowed public relations and political image to overshadow safety concerns. The symbolism of having a teacher in space became a powerful motivation to push forward no matter what. In hindsight, many argue that if Challenger had carried only career astronauts, the launch might have been delayed again. But with the eyes of the nation, and especially children, on the event, NASA prioritized spectacle over caution. This shift from exploration to publicity was one of the most dangerous factors leading to the disaster. The history of O-ring problems that NASA downplayed. The O-rings that failed on Challenger had a troubling history that NASA was fully aware of. Since the early days of the Shuttle program, engineers had documented erosion and blow-by of hot gases past the O-rings during several launches. While none of these incidents had caused a disaster, they showed a pattern of weakness that should have raised alarms. Instead of halting flights to redesign the joints, NASA adopted what is now called the normalization of deviance. They began treating these recurring issues as acceptable risks because missions continued to succeed despite the warning signs. This mindset is strange because it shows how success can breed complacency in even the most advanced organizations. Each time the O-rings performed poorly without causing a catastrophic failure, managers grew more confident that the system was reliable enough. By the time Challenger was preparing for launch, the O-ring issue was seen as a nuisance rather than a life-threatening flaw. In reality, the problem was a ticking time bomb. The fact that such a fundamental weakness was repeatedly ignored makes it clear that Challenger's fate was not a sudden accident, but rather the result of years of neglected warnings. The political pressure from the Reagan administration during the 1980s, the Space Shuttle was more than a scientific tool. It was a symbol of American strength during the Cold War, a demonstration of technological superiority meant to inspire national pride. President Reagan's administration was deeply invested in showcasing NASA as a success story. The Challenger mission, with Krista McAuliffe on board, perfectly aligned with this vision by connecting space travel to everyday citizens and classrooms. Delaying the launch yet again would have been an embarrassment, especially with Reagan planning to highlight the mission in his speech that very evening. It is strange to think that such political timing could influence decisions about the safety of astronauts. Yet internal documents and later testimony suggest that managers at NASA felt pressure to deliver results on schedule. In this environment, admitting that the shuttle had critical flaws or that weather conditions were too dangerous would have undermined the image of flawless progress that politicians wanted to project. The blending of political ambition with engineering decisions is one of the strangest and most dangerous aspects of the Challenger story. It shows how external pressures can distort judgment even in an organization tasked with protecting human life. The televised nature of the disaster Challenger was the first shuttle mission designed to capture the attention of children and families across the nation. Schools prepared to watch live broadcasts of Krista McAuliffe's journey into space, making the launch one of the most widely anticipated events in NASA's history. Millions of Americans were watching when the shuttle broke apart, creating a shared trauma unlike any space tragedy before it. The strange part is how unprepared NASA was for this level of exposure. In previous missions, the audience had largely been space enthusiasts and news outlets. This time, however, the agency had intentionally invited the participation of classrooms and families. There were no contingency plans for how to address a disaster broadcast to children in real time. Teachers, students, and parents watched in disbelief as the shuttle disintegrated, with no immediate explanation available. For many children, this was their first experience with tragedy on live television. The psychological impact was enormous, leaving scars that lasted for years. NASA's lack of preparation for handling such a scenario remains puzzling. They orchestrated a media spectacle to inspire, yet they seemed blind to the possibility that it could end in catastrophe. The misleading initial reports about the explosion when Challenger disintegrated, commentators, and even NASA officials quickly referred to it as an explosion. The image on television certainly looked like a massive detonation, with fire and smoke filling the sky. However, engineers later explained that the shuttle did not explode in the conventional sense. What actually happened was the rupture of the external fuel tank, which released liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. These mixed and ignited, creating the fiery cloud that the public perceived as an explosion. Meanwhile, the solid rocket boosters separated and continued flying uncontrollably for some time. This technical distinction matters because the public initially believed that the crew perished instantly in an explosion, but later analysis revealed that events were far more complex. The misleading language in those early hours shaped the narrative and left many misconceptions about what had really happened. It is strange that NASA allowed such confusion to persist rather than immediately clarifying the facts. The gap between perception and reality added to the sense of mystery and horror surrounding the disaster. It also demonstrated how little the general public understood about the true dangers of shuttle missions. The possibility that the crew survived the initial breakup, one of the most chilling and strange revelations about Challenger, is the evidence that the crew may have survived for several minutes after the shuttle broke apart. The crew cabin was found relatively intact in the wreckage, suggesting it had separated from the rest of the shuttle in one piece. Investigators discovered that some of the personal emergency air packs worn by the astronauts had been activated, which could only have happened after the breakup. This indicates that at least some crew members were conscious and aware of their situation. Experts believe they may have remained alive for the 2.5 minutes it took the cabin to fall to the Atlantic Ocean. Unfortunately, the impact with the water at over 200 miles per hour was unsurvivable. The idea that the crew endured those final moments, fully aware of their fate, is one of the most disturbing elements of the disaster. NASA has been careful about what details it releases out of respect for the families, but enough evidence exists to make this possibility undeniable. It raises haunting questions about what the astronauts experienced in those final seconds, questions that may never fully be answered. The lack of a crew escape system, one of the strangest and most tragic aspects of the Challenger disaster, is that the astronauts had no means of escape once the shuttle began to fail. In the early days of American spaceflight, astronauts in Mercury and Gemini capsules had ejection seats, or escape systems that could pull them away from a failing rocket. By the time of the shuttle program, NASA had abandoned the idea, arguing that the shuttle itself was safe enough, that such a system was unnecessary. For the first 4 shuttle flights, a limited ejection system existed for the pilot and commander, but even that was removed when larger crews became the standard. This decision reflected NASA's deep confidence in the shuttle design, but it also revealed how safety took a backseat to efficiency and image. The shuttle was promoted as a reusable spaceplane, more like an airliner than a risky experimental rocket. As a result, crew escape options were considered impractical and were never fully developed. After Challenger, critics pointed out that even a small chance of escape might have saved lives if the crew cabin had separated with parachutes or other protections. It is strange to think that, in a program costing billions of dollars, no serious effort was made to give astronauts an emergency survival option. This lack of foresight haunted the agency until further tragedies occurred. Only much later did NASA design bail-out procedures for specific scenarios, though they were still extremely limited. The absence of a crew escape system remains one of the most disturbing reminders that safety had been compromised for the sake of shuttle design simplicity. The normalization of deviance in NASA culture. Sociologist Diane Vaughan later studied the Challenger disaster and coined the term normalization of deviance to describe NASA's decision-making culture. This phrase explains how organizations begin to accept problems as normal when they repeatedly occur without leading to disaster. For NASA, the recurring O-ring erosion in previous shuttle flights should have been a red flag. Instead, managers treated it as an acceptable anomaly. Each successful mission reinforced the belief that the system was safe enough, even though evidence suggested otherwise. This cultural mindset was strange because NASA was supposed to be an organization that valued precision and caution above all else. Instead, it had developed an environment where small but consistent failures were brushed aside in the name of progress. The Challenger disaster exposed how this normalization allowed critical issues to slip through safety nets. Engineers were pressured to accept risk because management had already redefined what was considered dangerous. Over time, the boundary between acceptable risk and catastrophic danger became blurred. This is particularly haunting because it shows that the disaster was not a single moment of failure, but a slow erosion of safety standards. Challenger became the tragic result of years of decisions where known problems were rationalized away. Understanding this cultural flaw was crucial, as it later played a role in the Columbia disaster in 2003. The idea that an agency as advanced as NASA could fall victim to such human blind spots is one of the strangest and most troubling lessons from the Challenger tragedy. The strange timing of the solid rocket booster flame. When investigators examined footage of the Challenger launch, they noticed something odd just seconds after liftoff. At the 59-second mark, a small burst of flame appeared on the right solid rocket booster, exactly where the O-ring seal was located. This flame was not immediately catastrophic, but it grew in intensity as the shuttle climbed. By the 64-second mark, the flame had burned through a joint and was directed against the external fuel tank, weakening its structural integrity. At 73 seconds, the tank ruptured, leading to the shuttle breaking apart. What is strange is how quickly the failure escalated once it began, and how subtle the warning signs were in the early moments. Engineers, reviewing the footage later, realized that the disaster had essentially been visible before it happened, though no one in real time could have processed the danger. This detail underscores how razor-thin the margin of safety really was. The strange timing of the flame, appearing less than a minute into flight, showed that the O-rings had failed almost immediately due to the cold weather. Instead of the shuttle being doomed after several minutes in orbit, it was compromised almost from the instant it left the pad. The fact that such a small flame sealed the fate of a billion-dollar spacecraft and 7 lives illustrates the fragility of the design. The confusing communication during the launch sequence. Another strange element of the Challenger disaster is how communication unfolded during the launch sequence. In the seconds leading up to the shuttle breakup, the flight director and controllers in Mission Control in Houston did not recognize the seriousness of what was happening. Telemetry showed falling pressure in the external tank, but the controllers interpreted it as a sensor error. At the exact moment the shuttle was disintegrating, the flight dynamics officer was still reporting normal data. The astronauts themselves, according to the cockpit voice recorder, remained calm and unaware of the fatal damage until the very end. The last words recorded from the crew were not panic, but routine calls, such as calling out throttle settings. It is strange to realize that both Mission Control and the astronauts were unaware of the impending catastrophe, even as the shuttle was already failing structurally. This confusion was partly due to NASA's training culture, which prepared astronauts for specific failures but not for catastrophic structural breakup. In the aftermath, investigators pointed out that NASA had no procedures in place for sudden, complete vehicle failure at this stage of flight. The eerie calmness of the communication, followed by the silence when the shuttle disintegrated, remains one of the most unsettling details about Challenger. It shows how little time anyone had to react and how unexpected the failure truly was for those in control. The recovery efforts and the crew cabin discovery after Challenger disintegrated, debris rained down into the Atlantic Ocean. Recovery efforts took weeks, involving the U.S. Navy, Coast Guard, and NASA divers. What they found was deeply disturbing. The crew cabin, relatively intact, was discovered on the ocean floor. Inside were the remains of the 7 astronauts, confirming that the cabin had separated largely as one piece during the breakup. The discovery of activated air packs and personal items made it clear that the crew may have been alive during the fall. The recovery process was shrouded in secrecy out of respect for the families, but the details that did emerge were haunting. It is strange to think that even as the shuttle broke apart in a fiery cloud, the crew's final moments were not instantaneous. Instead, they may have endured nearly 3 minutes of terror before impact with the ocean. For investigators, recovering the cabin was essential to piecing together what had happened, but it also forced them to confront the brutal reality of the disaster in ways the public never fully saw. The decision to keep many details private was controversial, but NASA argued it was necessary to protect the dignity of the astronauts and their families. The strange mix of technical investigation and human tragedy in the recovery efforts continues to cast a heavy shadow over the Challenger story. The presidential response and national mourning. When Challenger was lost, the tragedy quickly moved beyond NASA and became a national crisis. President Ronald Reagan canceled his State of the Union address that night and instead delivered one of the most famous speeches of his presidency. He spoke directly to the children of America, telling them that sometimes painful things happen when people reach for the stars, but that exploration must continue. He honored the crew by saying they had slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. While the speech comforted many, some critics found it strange that it so quickly turned the astronauts into symbols rather than individuals whose deaths were preventable. The national mourning was real, with schools holding ceremonies and the names of the crew etched into history. But the rapid shift toward symbolism overshadowed some of the hard questions about why the disaster had happened. Instead of dwelling on the ignored warnings and flawed decisions, the public conversation quickly moved toward inspiration and resilience. This response is still debated today. Was it an appropriate way to honor the fallen, or did it help NASA escape deeper scrutiny in the immediate aftermath? The strange duality of grief and inspiration in the days after Challenger is a reminder of how societies process tragedy, often choosing to focus on heroism. The Rogers Commission's shocking findings. In the aftermath of the Challenger disaster, President Reagan established the Rogers Commission to investigate what went wrong. The findings were both technical and cultural, and they shocked the American public. The commission confirmed that the failure of the O-ring seals in the right solid rocket booster caused the shuttle to break apart, but it also went much deeper. The report revealed that NASA management had been warned repeatedly about the risks of launching in cold weather and had ignored or dismissed the concerns of engineers. It described a flawed decision-making process where schedule pressures and organizational culture overruled safety. Perhaps the strangest and most disturbing part of the Commission's work was how bluntly it described NASA's culture of denial. Engineers like Roger Boisjoly had essentially predicted the disaster, but their warnings were suppressed in the chain of command. Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman, who served on the commission, famously demonstrated how the O-ring became brittle in cold water by simply dipping a sample into a glass of ice water during a televised hearing. His direct approach cut through NASA's technical language and showed the public just how preventable the disaster had been. The Rogers Commission concluded that Challenger was not an accident in the usual sense, but a tragedy born of systemic failure. It is strange to reflect on how an agency celebrated for engineering excellence could be undone by communication breakdowns, politics, and misplaced priorities. The Commission's findings remain one of the clearest examples of how culture can be just as dangerous as mechanical failure in high-risk organizations. The long-term impact on the Shuttle program, the Challenger disaster, did not simply halt one mission. It shut down the entire Shuttle program for nearly 3 years. During that time, NASA faced intense scrutiny and was forced to redesign the solid rocket boosters to ensure the O-ring failure would never happen again. Crews were grounded, training was disrupted, and future missions were delayed indefinitely. The Shuttle program, once presented as a routine way to access space, suddenly looked fragile and unsafe. Public confidence was shaken, and many questioned whether the Shuttle was truly the reliable spaceplane NASA had promised. The strange part is how the disaster forced a complete shift in perception. Before Challenger, the Shuttle was seen almost like an airliner in the sky, something safe enough to fly teachers and eventually even ordinary citizens. After Challenger, it was once again seen as a dangerous experimental vehicle that demanded caution at every step. In some ways, this was a healthier view of the risks of spaceflight, but it came at the cost of 7 lives. Challenger's legacy reshaped the Shuttle program permanently, leading to stricter safety protocols, more transparency, and eventually to the conclusion decades later that the Shuttle itself was too risky to operate long-term. The strange dual legacy is that Challenger both damaged NASA's reputation and helped force the reforms needed to prevent further tragedies. Yet even with those reforms, the lessons were not fully absorbed, as shown by the Columbia disaster in 2003. Challenger's impact on the Shuttle program proved that some lessons are difficult for large institutions to hold on to over time. The haunting similarities to the Columbia disaster, perhaps the strangest and most tragic aspect of Challenger's legacy, is how history repeated itself 17 years later. In 2003, the Shuttle Columbia disintegrated upon re-entry, killing all 7 astronauts on board. Just like Challenger, the Columbia tragedy was not caused by an unforeseeable accident, but by a problem NASA had been warned about. Foam shedding from the external tank A had been observed on many earlier flights, but it was treated as an acceptable risk. Managers normalized the problem in much the same way they had normalized O-ring erosion. In Columbia's case,